Uh,
We've got 20 or so people on the call. Thanksgiving's coming is coming up, and we might say, well, wouldn't it be great if we had 60 or 80 or 120? Absolutely. And sometimes I wonder whether my title sounds a little bit weighty, a little bit down, a little bit gloomy. And it's possible it scares a few people off. If I'd said something like, salmon, killer whales, and me, a story about coastal BC, maybe we'd attract more people to the table. Sometimes there's a trick of marketing therein and a lesson. But the point is, from my perspective, this is a universally important topic that is close to every one of our uh, hearts, homes, yards, and neighborhoods. It's all about water. Water is central as a necessary for each and every one of us. Without water, we wouldn't survive more than 3.5 or 4 days at the outmost. And without clean water, of course, as we know from parts of Canada, notably on some reserves, and certainly parts of Southeast Asia and Africa, dirty water can kill and does kill hundreds of thousands of people every single year. So water is universally and supremely important. And I put it to you that perhaps we suffer from an embarrassment of riches here in Canada. We hold 25% of the world's fresh water. And we've got a very small population and a low population density compared to with the size of our country affording us this great luxury of lots and lots of water. And yet, look at it. Look at us. Droughts, floods, pollution. We've got lots of water news these years. We've got lawsuits against the federal government on behalf of First Nations about uh, dangerous drinking water on reserve. And we've got the most polluted or contaminated whales on the planet. So, water is profoundly important to all of us here in BC as people, as neighbors, and as custodians of a spectacular part of the world. So I think it's important, and it doesn't have to be weighty. It doesn't have to be a gloomy story. And I'm going to try to get that across with a bit of balance tonight and a bit of insight as to why I think the bad news, uh, in effect, is a very powerful way of creating good news. And that is through scientific study of what has gone wrong to the world around us and unearthing, discovering some of the bad news stories out there in a way that informs regulations, policies, best practices, enforcement, mitigation, solutions, restoration, you name it. There's lots of positive opportunity out there for each and every one of us and for our governments of different levels and colors and for industry and stakeholders across the spectrum. Almost 25 years ago to this day, I published a story that garnered a lot of media attention at the time. It was a paper that established our beloved killer whales as the most PCB contaminated marine mammals in the world. PCBs dominate at the top of the food chain as a pollutant, as a contaminant. PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, are only made by man. There are no natural analogs or no natural sources. These are industrial chemicals, and they're widely used between 1929 and the late 1970s. They were stable, heat resistant um, oils that were widely used to prevent heat or degradation of machinery or, in fact, fires. And they were also used very widely in hydroelectric transformers. For example, household would have to have its electricity transformed from the 110,000 volts that is distributed along your street to 110 or 120 volts in your house. So that meant that that gray bucket outside your house up on the telephone pole or the utilities pole was filled with PCBs. And in fact, it might still be filled with PCBs because they are allowed to be used in closed applications in Canada until next year. So even though we banned them from manufacture, trade, uh, or disposal in 1977, they may be used in closed applications to this day. So this is a little bit of a puzzle to me, because we've already been able to determine these are harmful contaminants. They are cancer-causing agents. They disrupt our endocrine system. They cause premature birth. They lead to small for gestational age babies. They affect the immune system and brain development in infants and young children. They're long-lasting chronic developmental toxicants. And, you know, if I could put it in a nutshell, I'd say hormone mimics or endocrine disruptors, not acute poisons. So when we found that the levels in the transient killer whales that eat marine mammals were 5 times higher than the previously thought to be most contaminated marine mammal in the world, and that was the St. Lawrence estuary beluga, I got phone calls from people, including my colleagues in Quebec, who said, Peter, you guys have made a dilution error. You must be off by a factor of 10, because our whales, our beluga whales, are the most contaminated marine mammals in the world. So we, of course, double checked, and we were correct. They were not. And the story since then has been one of, oh, what do we do about this? Where are they coming from? Are they hurting the whales? And of course, right about the same time, Canada advanced the Species at Risk Act, and the southern resident killer whales became listed as endangered under SARA, which meant Ottawa, Canada, had a legal obligation to protect and recover these whales. As you know, the southern residents number fewer than 74 individuals today, and that's a very small population. That's down about 25% since the time that we published this study. If you like graphs, you'll see in the blue square the 3 populations that we studied: northern residents, southern residents, and transients. The northern residents and southern residents are the salmon eaters, and the transients are, of course, the marine mammal eaters. They eat seals and whales and sea lions. The transients are today named Bigg's killer whales, Bigg apostrophe S. Michael Bigg was a scientist at the Fisheries and Oceans Canada. He developed the photo ID catalog technique of being able to track every individual, such that over time we got to know the age, gender, and feeding ecology for each individual whale and who was related to who. This was very powerful, and in effect, it meant that these are the most studied, the best understood marine mammals, certainly whales, on the planet. And this gave us a great amount of strength when it came to interpreting the results from analyzing these tiny little biopsies of skin and blubber that we're able to secure, weighing about 300 milligrams from a DART projector. You'll notice the females in pink are less contaminated than the males, and that's, of course, because they're offloading these chemicals that are found in blubber and fat, hence lipids, to their nursing calves. Good news for the female that loses these toxic chemicals. Bad news for the calf that is, in fact, 1 position higher than his or her mother in the food chain and exposed to very high levels of these harmful contaminants. So we've learned a lot from this study and beyond, and we've learned a lot about where these chemicals are coming from, and I'll speak a little bit to that as we go through the talk. But in keeping with my desire to keep this conversation as one that is enabling, empowering, and positive with a little bit of good news, the environmental sciences carried out in the 1970s and 80s and since has allowed us to really track some of these contaminants of concern in the environment, and to stand up with scientific authority and peer-reviewed publications and say, hey, Ottawa, or hey, Washington, D.C., or hey, Brussels or Tokyo, we have a problem here. These contaminants are very persistent. That's why they were commercially interesting, but they're persistent, and they're getting into the food chain, and they're getting amplified up through the different levels of the food chain to unacceptably high levels in some of the species that we really cherish, like the southern resident killer whales. Canada in the early 1980s discovered that the Inuit of the far north were, in fact, the most contaminated people on the planet. And this led to a lot of research and a lot of concern that remote populations relying on indigenous foods or country foods were being exposed to high levels of contaminants, not because their food was more contaminated necessarily, but or that they were living next to industry, but because they were eating 25 times as much aquatic foods or seafoods as the average Southern Canadian. So there's, in effect, higher in the food chain than Southern Canadians or than the average Canadian. And this finding shocked Ottawa into action, and Ottawa proceeded with a massive long-term science to policy initiative that allowed us to track PCBs and related compounds in aquatic species in the Arctic over space and over time, and to look at how that shaped the quality or the safety of seafood for Inuit peoples or First Nations as well. And this galvanized or catapulted Ottawa into a position of policy energy, if I could put it that way, where Ottawa basically said, we don't want persistent contaminants traveling through the atmosphere or ocean currents, getting into remote areas where our indigenous peoples are then exposed to unacceptably high levels of harmful contaminants. We don't want that. But we can't go it alone because our evidence is starting to suggest that what we're finding in Arctic food webs is not simply coming from Canada. It's coming from global sources, from the long-range transport from Eurasia, as well as North America. And so Canada led the negotiations for the Stockholm Convention. If you've heard of it, it was a treaty that became international law in 2001. And that was a very important instrument whereby signatories were compelled to agree that they would have national laws prohibiting the manufacture, trade, sale, or disposal of the dirty dozen, as they called them back when Stockholm first became treaty. There were 12 priority persistent contaminants of concern, including PCBs and including DDT, the pesticide, as well as dioxins and furans. So all of this energy from the scientific research in the field to the regulators in national capitals to the Stockholm Convention has vastly improved the safety and quality of traditional seafoods for coastal First Nations, but also the levels of some of these chemicals in our high trophic level species or species at the top of the food chain. For example, the harbor seal here, one of my favorite study animals, has seen a very dramatic over 5-fold decline in the concentration of PCBs since the late 1970s. And killer whales, we have estimated, are down almost 8 times since the peak PCB levels in their tissues in 1970. So the source control and the regulatory environment has been conducive to progress on the environmental quality front with declines in many chemicals of concern. The dirty dozen has been expanded. There are many more contaminants have been added to the Stockholm Convention's listing process, and that basically reflects the fact that the international community agrees that chemicals with 3 properties should not be on the market: persistence, they bioaccumulate, and they're toxic. Those 3 features cannot be found in a single chemical, and one cannot sell, use, dispose of, or trade chemicals with those 3 properties. And Canada's law is called CEPA, the Chemical Management Plan, under CEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So some good news in there. For me as a scientist, I've often relied on sentinels out there or canaries that tell me something about what's going on with environmental health, because top of the food chain indicators or the sentinel species, including the lowly blue mussel down here in the lower right, serve to integrate contaminant or pollution information from the water and give us a signal as to what's happening with species we're interested in, whether it's culturally, economically, or from a food or a recreational perspective. And they give us a good way to track progress, good or bad, in terms of the concentrations or trends of contaminants of concerns concern in the environment. That said, we have a lot of challenges. Think for a minute about our salmonid species that spawn in freshwater streams, rivers, and lakes. They start to grow up in freshwater, then they head down into the estuaries and then out into the marine environment, where the 5 dominant species of wild salmon, including Chinook salmon that is prized by southern resident and northern resident killer whales, grow. And in a sense, they're foraging offshore. They are grazing the abundant phytoplankton, zooplankton, and small fish out at sea, and they're slowly accumulating contaminants from the Pacific Ocean and bringing those back into our coastal waters and up into our freshwater environments. So think for a minute about how one, as a scientist or as a manager, might want to tackle the problem of trying to figure out where salmon are being exposed to harmful contaminants and how we would demonstrate whether those contaminants are harmful to the salmon itself, or whether the chemicals are not necessarily harmful to salmon, but they might accumulate in salmon and then be transferred over into killer whales or onto our plates. So very complicated, looking at causal relationships between sources, the accumulation in salmon, and the potential for biological injury in salmon, let alone killer whales. So really tough to think about the anadromous habitat needs of salmon and figure out what we can do to reduce discharges or releases or land uses that are really drivers of decline or degradation. And in the absence of guidance on that file, it makes it very difficult for policymakers or regulators to step in and say, hey, we have to do something about pulp mills or municipal wastewater treatment plants or cosmetic use of pesticides in people's gardens. Very, very difficult without some kind of evidence that that chemical or that activity is a priority. So we're working on that. Many people are, but it's a bad news story for many government agencies, so sometimes it's difficult to solicit the kind of support from federal agencies that might otherwise be responsible for this file. So lots of work to do, and I'm going to turn the table a little bit and just say this. I'd like you to think of this as our invisible crisis, because most chemicals, most contaminants, most toxics are invisible, with the exception of perhaps a couple of major examples, one being an oil or chemical spill, very visible, or litter, plastic debris, fishing nets, straws, and so forth. These are things that are visible, but most of the chemicals that we have on the market that get into water and into our food webs are invisible and hence poorly understood by the average person on the street. Very difficult to craft a story of concern around something that people don't see every day and don't see in our food or water. But let me say that we do have pesticides, industrial chemicals, and plastics entering the water from air and from multiple sectors and activities in our environment, and that pollution in general is threatening and or impacting the well-being of salmon, whales, and people in British Columbia. So it is complicated. I'm going to shock you with this number. Over 100 million chemicals have been designed by humankind. 100 million. Nearly 500,000, somewhere between 350 and 500,000 chemicals are on what we call the global marketplace or are in high production volume. That means they are commonly used in consumer applications as well as industrial practices. And as many as 1,000 new chemicals are designed every single year. They are put to market after registration in our national capital with a standardized risk-based evaluation with such things as, how much dissolves in water, at what point does it evaporate, how quickly does it break down. There are some metrics that Ottawa requires industry to provide to them before they allow a chemical in the market. And the safety of a new chemical is evaluated using short-term toxicity tests using Daphnia, that's the water flea, and rainbow trout. Those are the two test species which Ottawa uses to say, we're going to protect the Canadian environment using those two species. So you can well imagine how the killer whale would fail to be protected by evidence coming from the water flea and from rainbow trout. I think there's considerable appetite to re-energize the risk-based regulation of chemicals in Ottawa, and there are opportunities to do so without unduly harming the economic portfolios of some of our big users of chemicals. It is complicated, but I'll land on the last bullet here, which is that I can categorize pollutants or chemicals into two uh, um, sort of entities, either ones that dissolve in water or ones that dissolve in fats or particles. So think for a minute about making your Italian dressing at home. You've got oil and vinegar. Well, the chemicals that we're talking about on the market will favor dissolution in the vinegar or in the oil. And those that dissolve in the oil, they're called fat soluble chemicals, and those are the ones that are potentially harmful in the food chain, like PCBs or DDT. So we can categorize the potential behavior or the potential fate of some of these contaminants or chemicals by understanding something about their properties and whether they dissolve in water or dissolve in fats. We have another challenge in Canada, and that is that there are many different agencies and many different pieces of legislation that deal with water or pollution. And it makes it very, very complicated. And it allows Ottawa to basically um, not pursue assertively what it could be pursuing if it really wanted to tackle pollution, because industry likes to divide and conquer, and Ottawa, is often shy about dealing with industry. And so we have pollution issues that are covered in different ways by different agencies and organizations, as well as pieces of legislation. This makes it very, very difficult for us to protect something like a killer whale or salmon or human health when these three groups are basically exposed to contaminants coming through different mechanisms, whether it's air, water, supermarket foods, or country foods. When we look at coastal BC, what do we see? What do we know about pollution, and how can we develop a little bit of a litmus test to be able to give some confidence about the quality of the state of our environment, and how might we track that over space and over time? And I would put to you that the first way is through the study of sediments. And these are two maps for PCBs and PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers in blue on the right. Those are flame retardants that are now banned, largely because of what we were finding in marine mammals. They were banned in 2007. But the surface sediments retain a record of our activities and our pollution. And we can see the hot spots for PCBs and for PBDEs in the Strait of Georgia and Juan-de-Fuca Strait. And that reflects, their use in industrialized or urban areas such as Metro Vancouver or Vancouver. You notice up in the northern Strait of Georgia a little bit of a contamination hotspot, it looks like, probably due to some of the communities and industries up there, but also because there's less natural burial of these contaminants because there's less sedimentation. Sedimentation is something that buries historical contaminants over time. It's a natural process, and it's probably the best hope we have of improving the quality of our environment with some of these chemicals that are just so persistent. The other thing to note with these maps is that they provide us with an indication as to where our species of interest or concern might be most exposed to contaminants. So for example, if you're a killer whale, you'd be plying the waters throughout these maps. But if you're eating local fish, flatfish, or herring, or even salmon that spent time in some of these hot spots, you're likely to be taking in more contaminants than if you were feeding in one of the less contaminated areas. So these contaminated sediments basically contaminate the adjacent food webs. And so understanding what's going on in these contaminated hotspots is very important. There are cleanups, remediation that can be pursued. These sorts of studies can also inform land-based source controller cleanups, because sometimes we have old industries that are leaking PCBs or chemicals out into our coastal waters. So studying sediments can be a very powerful way of informing action and restoration of our coastal ecosystems. And it was with that in mind that we developed the pollution tracker program during my time at the Vancouver Aquarium slash Oceanwise. And pollution tracker, if you don't know it, you can Google it. It's a free online compendium of information about contaminant levels at upwards of 60 sites up and down the coast of British Columbia in two matrices. One is mussels that filter up anywhere from 10 to 100 liters of water a day, and therefore give a synthetic idea of what's happening in the water column, and sediments, as just discussed about the value of looking at sediments. So pollution tracker tracks pollutants of concern, 14 classes of pollutants of concern up and down the coast of British Columbia. It's been underway since the year 2015. I've just cut out 3 snapshots here for 3 of the sites up and down the coast. One is Victoria Harbor site number 1. The second one is Burrard Inlet site number 5. And the third one is Dixon Island off the west coast of Vancouver Island. And lo and behold, Victoria Harbor comes in with the number 1 ranking. You see in red these little scorecards for different classes of contaminants. Number 1 and 2 for a whole variety of different contaminants. And the Burrard Inlet site, 3, 5, 5, 6, 6, 7. So it's also fairly contaminated with an average, I can't even see the average. It's just at the top of the screen, but Victoria Harbor is ranked number 1 coastwide, this site number 1, and Burrard Inlet is ranked number 9. You can see the little number at the top of your screen right there. And Dixon Island is ranked number 23. So sorry, I just escaped from presentation mode to be able to view that myself. And so why is this? Well, it's clear that Victoria and Burrard Inlet are industrialized harbors. They're very active. There's been a history of nearly 200 years of activities by industry and us people, colonial governments, etc. But why is Victoria so contaminated? Well, the big reason, and I think the evidence is right here, that it's the most contaminated, not in terms of a single contaminant or pollutant, but a whole list of contaminants. And that to me means that what we're talking about is a vulnerable receiving environment where there's not very much freshwater input, not very much sedimentation and burial of these industrial chemicals. Whereas we go over to Burrard Inlet, we say, ooh, there's a lot of alkyl phenols. Those are industrial surfactants. Burrard Inlet site number 5 is ranked number 3 for these industrial surfactants. But you go down to PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, ranked number 6, and then you can get down here to number 10 at the bottom for lead, and number 9 for pesticides. So you see more variation in the scores for Burrard Inlet, and that to me is a reflection of the fact that we've got more sedimentation and burial, and more the ones that come to the top are the ones that are really locally being discharged to excess. For Dixon Island, again, a lot of variation, everywhere from 7th in terms of ranking up and down the coast for this fire retardant chemical. It's called hexabromocyclododecane, down to 29th for the hydrocarbons. So a lot of variation. Again, telling us that, hey, we've got a couple issues up here locally in terms of Dixon Island, and the HBCD may be coming from some of the discharges from industry on the west coast of Vancouver Island. So Pollution Tracker for the first time gives us that report card on what are the contaminants of concern up and down the coast. What are the chemicals, and are they site specific, and are there particular hotspots for that chemical? And what do we do with this information? Can we remediate? Can we turn off the tap? Can we regulate a certain chemical in Ottawa? Can we hunker down and reduce or increase the requirements for waste discharge permits that the province gives out? Or is there something that we can do in terms of remediation? Bear in mind that Victoria Harbor and Burrard Inlet those waters are dredged, those sediments are dredged for navigation purposes. And the dredgeate, historically, before there was a little bit of noise around this file, were deposited out in the Strait of Georgia, basically in or adjacent to critical habitat, southern resident killer whales. So there are a lot of issues around sediments. There's a lot of information therein, and there are a lot of potential implications for harmful effects on our species of interest, and also there's a lot of potential for us to modify our practices, whether it's regulations, enforcement, or best practices, to try to reduce the concentrations we're running into in some of these hotspots. A lot of that is a story about our local activities, but we've got to acknowledge that these PCBs can be transported through our atmosphere from Asia to our coastline in as little as 5 or 6 days. So the atmosphere in our global environment is basically a conveyor belt that can deliver contaminants across the ocean with impunity. And that means it's really important for us to work internationally on some of these pollution issues. And in fact, the same thing goes for the Arctic, where we've been able to ascertain that PCBs and pesticides can move from Ohio or Central Asia up into the Arctic in a matter of 7 or 8 days. So the atmosphere delivers contaminants of different kinds to the remote Arctic, and as a result, it can threaten the food security for our indigenous people that rely on country foods there. A case in point here is a study that we carried out several years ago together with Fisheries and Oceans Canada and a cruise ship firm called One Ocean Expeditions. And we worked aboard 4 icebreakers to collect samples throughout the polar region, stretching from Greenland and Norway across through the North Pole into the Beaufort Sea and the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And we found microplastics in all but 1 sample. So 96 samples, we found microplastics, dominated by microfibers. These are little fibers that all averaged about 12 microns thickness. They were different colors, excuse me, red, yellow, green, white, black. And they were virtually all polyester. And we even found them at the North Pole. And so the evidence from what we've been studying and what others have found is really pointing to laundry and wastewater effluent as the drivers of microfiber and microplastic pollution of the world's oceans. So really, shockingly, wide distribution of microfibers around the world. In fact, at the North Pole, I think we had 47 microplastic particles in a cubic meter of seawater. Interestingly, what we found was that the concentrations were highest in the eastern Arctic, around Greenland and the North Atlantic, and they were lowest in the Beaufort Sea towards the Bering Sea in the western Arctic. And the other thing that we found is that as we moved from east to west, you'll see a little graph there, there was a significant relationship between longitude and microplastic concentration. So that, in addition to some other evidence, led us to conclude that the Atlantic Ocean is actually pumping microplastic particles and microfibers into the Arctic. In fact, that's logical because the Atlantic Ocean delivers much more water to the Arctic than does the Pacific. And that's been established through oceanographic studies. So much more water entering from the North Atlantic. And that means that the Arctic is becoming contaminated by basically municipal wastewater and microfibers from our clothing that's coming from the eastern seaboard of North America and northern Europe. So not immune to anything, no matter where we go. I'm going to switch a little bit here and talk to the program I've been setting up at Raincoast, and that's called Healthy Waters, because I've worked long and hard to deliver scientific articles to the international scientific community and provide advice to governments in Canada and abroad. I'm now turning my attention more to local activities and those in a position to do something within a given watershed. And what I mean here is that I think that there is more valuation of the pollution file, more concern about the environment at street level in our watersheds around British Columbia. And certainly First Nations very concerned about the safety and the quality of environment and country foods. And so we've embarked on this journey that is engaging community groups, Indigenous organizations, First Nations governments, other agencies at different levels of government, and community organizations. And we start with this: water. It is simple, it's important, it's vital, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals cite it as critically important and something we have to pay attention to. And we have to use that simplicity to drive the conversation ahead and get some communications going around the research, the monitoring, the actions to protect it. So our Healthy Waters program espouses a very simplified sampling formula within each of our watersheds. And it's these 5 categories of water that we look to: source water, fresh water, urban runoff, tap water, and marine water. And so if you think about this, this is water as it drains from mountaintop down through our human activities and into the ocean. And it's water that anadromous species like salmon would be relying on. And of course, killer whales would be downstream of all of this. If we acknowledge that over 80% of pollutants in the ocean are coming from land, then this perspective affords us the opportunity to track the emergence of pollution problems along water's journey down slopes, through cities, past industry, into the ocean. And so source water is upstream of human activities. Fresh water is basically salmon habitat. Urban runoff includes road runoff. Tap water, well, we're part of the water cycle. We rely on water from the source, and we're borrowing it, and then we're polluting it through various means and putting it back into the environment or back into fish habitat. So we really wanted to bring tap water along with this journey. We are looking at a number of different contaminants of concern. In fact, almost 600 different pollutants that we look for, from basic ones like nutrients, fecal coliform, and metals, to more elaborate ones like hydrocarbons, pesticides, surfactants, pharmaceuticals, tire chemicals, and so forth, as well as PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are the forever chemicals. So we're trying to get a very intensive snapshot of water quality twice a year, during the dry season, during the wet season, using this approach. These are the partnerships that we have. These are the watersheds that we're working on. And so we've got a nice mix of scales and degrees to which these watersheds are impacted or likely to be impacted by human activities. Some are more remote and some are more industrial. Most of these have very strong First Nations expressions of interest and support in what we're doing, and we're working very closely with each partner within each watershed to make sure that we're transparent, we're working in confidence, and we're training and creating capacity where there's a desire to do that. We have a new Mercedes-Benz Sprinter cargo van that we've converted into a mobile water pollution lab. That allows us to go and collect samples appropriately, to store them, to subdivide them, and to do some testing in the vehicle itself. And that creates an opportunity to be transparent as well. And it also creates an opportunity to train and build capacity in the field. So this is a super addition to our Healthy Waters program. I'll give you 2 snapshots of how we've been able to deploy and basically generate insight into the state of waters in these watersheds. The first is at Whistler. This is one of our partnerships. Most of our other partnerships, we're trying to get the approval from our local partners to share the results, but the intention is to do this for every single partnership. And in fact, our Whistler team, where we're working with the Whistler Lakes Conservation Foundation, has two watersheds. Whistler actually has water that either drains south down into the Cheakamus River down into Howe Sound, or it drains to the northeast into the Green River, Lillooet River, and the Harrison River, and then down into the Fraser. So a very interesting bifurcation of the journey that water might pursue. And then we had a number of those sampling sites categorized into those 5 categories that basically would allow us to tell a story about what's happening in Whistler. I'll give you a couple of results here. The first one, PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Think about petroleum products or coal or smoke. All of these have hydrocarbons in them. There are thousands of them. We detected many. And interestingly, we found that the highest concentrations were in tap water. But they were still relatively low in terms of concentration. When we looked at the profile or the signature or the constituent compounds in that complex mixture of PAHs, and that's that slightly more difficult to read plot on the bottom half of your screen, we can basically say that that some of the samples had pHs that looked as though they were impacted by solid fuel combustion, whereas others looked a little bit more like fossil fuel. So it's just a way of saying, hey, you've got pHs in there. Where are they coming from? Are they coming from wood or paper burning, or are they coming from liquid fossil fuels from a vehicle, or are they coming from a liquid fossil fuel that's been combusted? So that's a very powerful tool. And in fact, we're finding a lot of solid fuel combustion evidence across our watersheds in source water and tap water. And that's probably because of the forest fire smoke. So we're picking that up with our signature analysis. PCBs I spoke to, these are a concern for killer whales. We had one exceedance of environmental quality guideline in our source water. I don't know why that is. We're looking to follow up with our next set of samples to figure out whether this was a one-off or whether we've got a little bit of an issue in that source water. But most of the concentrations were relatively low and the signature was fairly light. And by that, I mean less chlorinated. There are 209 PCBs. Some are less chlorinated, some are more chlorinated. And so at this point, we'd say the evidence suggests that atmospheric transport and deposition from distant sources is explaining the presence of PCBs in Whistler. Forever chemicals, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, you might have heard of them. More common names for a couple of the 15,000 compounds in this family of contaminants or chemicals are Teflon and Scotchgard. You might have heard of those two. They're not used anymore in the same formulation, but we're finding high concentrations in all of our watersheds in road runoff. And we're still finding modest concentrations in our other waters as well. So this is a hot topic that we'll be following because there are major lawsuits happening in the US and big concerns in Europe. Most of the PFAS concerns in Canada at this point in time are focused on aqueous firefighting foam products that are used at airports and military facilities to put out fires. So PFAS was used as a surfactant in those foams. And when you practice with those, you get these forever chemicals draining off into the ditches around the airport. So there are some contaminated sites that we have to deal with on this file. When we looked at pharmaceuticals, look at this. We're finding diabetes medication. We're finding sucralose or Splenda as an artificial sweetener. We're finding caffeine, DEET, penicillin. We're finding the breakdown product of nicotine. We find cocaine upon occasion. We're finding these things in river water in Whistler. And so understanding where this is coming from, why we're finding it, allows us a conduit to talking to the engineers and the municipal authorities around their wastewater treatment plant processes, the integrity of their network of pipes throughout Whistler, as well as, excuse me, their performance of septic tanks and septic fields. So it does speak to that, as well as the opportunity to create a stronger educational program around recycling old unused pharmaceuticals where you take it back to the pharmacy. The second example is with the study that we carried out during the floods in the Lower Fraser Valley in late 2021, early 2022. And we went forth and collected 33 samples of water in fish habitat because nobody else was. Governments of the day were worried about public safety, private property, the integrity of roads and rails, and wastewater treatment plants, as well as livestock. Fish habitat was down at the bottom of the list of priorities, but our First Nations colleagues were concerned. And as we saw the flood waters rise up over old industry and over homes and businesses, as well as farms, I said, that's not going to be good for the quality of fish habitat. And so we went out and collected samples at 4 points in time. And this sucralose will give us an indication of human impact in the flood waters. And here the graph is showing water from Frost Creek. That is our remote site up in the mountains to the south of Cultus Lake. And then down into the valley and into these areas where we get fairly high concentrations of this artificial sweetener, Splenda. You've no doubt heard of Splenda. It's the most popular artificial sweetener, but it's also a tracer of human waste because we do not metabolize it and it doesn't get broken down in wastewater treatment plants. So when we find it in water, it means there's a source of that, and it might be leaking septic, it might be overflowing wastewater treatment plants, and certainly that was all happening during the floods. And it's consistent with what we found with fecal coliform, and you find the high concentrations of E. coli in some of the same waters that were impacted heavily by sucralose, or where we find high concentration of sucralose. So this is a way of teasing out where the problems are originating from. This is human liquid waste coming from our homes and our wastewater treatment systems, as well as septic. So that's a way to tell that story. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to harm fish with sucralose, but it does mean there are probably a lot of co-occurring contaminants of more concern, like pesticides and other pharmaceuticals that are more problematic for fish. So by the numbers, this is what we did during that study. And I just want to point out here that while we had 59 exceedances of environmental quality guidelines saying we've got 59 different contaminants in different locations that were present at levels that were harmful, that would be harmful to fish, you'll note here that we only have guidelines for 23% of the contaminants of the chemicals we're looking for. So 23%. That means that Ottawa and Victoria and other provinces don't have guidelines to be able to evaluate what the other 77% of contaminants might do to fish. For example, there are no guidelines in Canada for any pharmaceuticals. There are no guidelines for environmental quality or drinking water quality for any pharmaceuticals except for estrogen or estradiol. So we have a challenge in Canada to try to figure out how we gauge the threat associated with such things as pharmaceuticals and some of the new generation contaminants. What do we do with those? Does that mean we can drink cocaine in our drinking water with impunity, or metformin, or DEET? I don't think so, but I think there's some work that we can do in support of our regulators and our risk assessors as we look to the quality of water that we've got that we're either using as drinking water or recreational water, or that our wildlife are relying on. So when does bad news actually become good news? And what I'm finding is, and I think this is very in keeping with the era that we find ourselves in today, and that's the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, which is signed into law in BC, the UNDRIPA Act. That compels me to strengthen my approach to practicing my expertise as a Western trained scientist in a way that is in lockstep with Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. And I find that that allows us to create a stronger approach that speaks to species and habitats of value to cultures and to food, social, and ceremonial practices, but it allows me to also bring my own professional toolbox to be able to look at some of these contaminants that are very new to the natural world around us. We want to share the data, we want to document the priorities, and we want to brainstorm in a sort of an innovation style manner together with our partners, with community members, because as knowledge generators and data generators, we can interpret our findings, but as a scientist, I don't always want to lecture people as to what we must do or should do unless I'm really invited. But really, our job as scientists is to present the problem, define the problem, and then provide guidance in terms of source, transport, risk of biological injury, and the potential actions that one could possibly implement. But at the same time, we've got policymakers, regulators, we've got governments of different with different sets of responsibilities. We've got industry, we've got consumers and homeowners. Everyone's got their skin in the game. And so we hope that our findings are meaningful and allow us all as a society to take advantage of what we've discovered and to create a more sustainable natural environment such that we can trust the water that we're playing in. I will say, though, that in dealing with coastal First Nations, it's not just an obligation to protect one of the important constituencies in our community. It's that coastal First Nations are more vulnerable to water pollution than the average Canadian. From our own work with as many as 1,000 individual First Nations consumers up and down the coast, we've been able to basically say that aquatic foods are 15 times more consumed by coastal First Nations than the average consumer. And that to me means that coastal First Nations are 15 times more more at risk, if you will, to the concerns around pollution, and much more intimately connected to the quality of aquatic foods. And of course, in the news these days again is drinking water quality on reserves, where we still have fecal coliform contamination in some parts. We've got lead, we've got organohalogens, we've got a number of concerns that that the quality is not safe, and that's a file. It's a human rights file as far as I'm concerned, but it really compels us to think about water and the full water cycle in a watershed. So the bad news and the good news, well, we can identify contaminants in the environment. That's my job, that merit regulatory enforcement action. We can overhaul approaches to chemical management through international treaties or national legislation, and we can innovate. There's lots of exciting opportunities today for green infrastructure at the municipal level, to the way in which we design roadways and runoff and bridges. We can contribute to the recovery of species at risk, where there are action plans to recover species. And there's a lot of work. In fact, my colleague Dave Scott at Raincoast Conservation Foundation has been overseeing 3 breaches of the jetty in the North Arm of the Fraser Estuary that is allowing juvenile salmon to spend a little bit more time in the estuary, whereas before they got basically channeled straight out into the Strait of Georgia, where they were predated or they didn't get the food that they needed. So there's a multi-million-dollar restoration initiative that we've been leading at Raincoast, and it's been supported by Ottawa. And I think this is a positive thing. It's a way of being innovative and forward-looking and practical, and it also acknowledges the science of the day, i.e. what we've learned about the needs of salmon during their different phases of their life cycle. And it's also acknowledging that what we've done from an engineering perspective in the past has not always been conducive to healthy salmon or healthy wildlife populations. So the restoration agenda is one that's it's a bit exciting these days. So I'll end there. I hope I didn't go over time, but I want to thank the water champions in this room And of course, I'm very grateful to all of our watershed partners without naming them all here. We do have a website if you're interested in this topic. And there are downloadable reports that speak to the Sumas floods or to our watershed partners. Um, and as we watch over the next couple of months, we'll see more and more reports that we'll be posting. So we're hoping to build an alliance of watershed-based communities that will be supporting this work. And I'm very excited that, hopefully by this time next year, we'll have a fully loaded website that'll be interactive, and it'll allow us to use a scorecard approach to prioritizing contaminants of concern in different areas and trying to learn the lessons both within watersheds and across watersheds. Within a watershed, you could say, hey, we've got a problem with pesticide X or fecal coliform or lead, or we could say, hey, source water has DEET in it, this insect repellent. Why is that? What can we do about it? And that's across watersheds. And so if it's across watershed, there's perhaps more value in talking to Ottawa as a regulator of chemicals on the market, whereas within a watershed, it may be more appropriate to work on source control within the watershed and identifying the activity that's degrading fish habitat in that watershed. So I'll end up there. Thank you all. I have not been tracking any chat, so I don't know if there's anything in the chat. I'll open that up now, but thanks for your time.
You ready with the questions, Carolyn?
Yes, I'm just trying to, I'm sorry. Yes, I was just trying to unmute people.
Oh, people can unmute themselves.
Oh, can they?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. And how do we see Peter? How do we share the screen with him?
Well, I can see the chat questions now. So do you want me to sort of navigate, and I'll ask, for example, Christine to verbalize the question that she's got posted at 8:02?
Sure.
Christine, do you want to pose your question?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Peter. That was fascinating and really far-reaching. There's one thing that caught my ear, and tell me if did I misunderstand or did I understand correctly? You were talking about it was the slide which had the two graphs of the persistent chemicals in the Salish Sea. And did you say that sedimentation of those chemicals is the best way of actually removing them from the landfill, from the environment? In other words, locking them up in a landfill without using the word landfill?
Yeah, and so there are multiple answers for your question. When I say sedimentation is our best hope for remediation over time, that's basically acknowledging the model around the world that we as a species, we have domestic wastewater that goes through wastewater treatment plants, gets into the ocean. We have industrial discharges that get into the ocean. We have non-point source runoff from roads and farms that get into the ocean or get into water. And that anything therein that escapes the technologies that we have in place to treat the discharge is going to end up in a receiving environment that in the paradigm in British Columbia is, and basically around the world. Let's look at the vulnerability of the receiving environment. So if we're releasing something into Harrison Lake, the province would say, well, let's look at the concentration of a discharge and times the volume, and then look at the receiving environment, how big it is. It can receive less pollutant loadings than the Strait of Georgia can. So we're fundamentally, what we do in Canada is we say, we are going to pollute the environment. We just don't want to pollute it in a way that harms it. I mean, philosophically, that's the paradigm. So anything that gets out there, what we want to happen is we want dilution. You remember the old adage, the solution of pollution is dilution. It holds true in a practical way, even though it's a little bit troubling, but dilution happens. Sedimentation, yes, because a lot of these persistent chemicals will bind to particles instead of fats and then drop out into the sediments. and then they get buried by cleaner sediments. For example, the Fraser River is releasing all sorts of glacial particles, silt that will be burying some of the more contaminated, basically created as a function of us releasing pollutants in Metro Vancouver, for example. So sedimentation is something that we know happens naturally, and it does bury these chemicals that would otherwise be available to the food chain for centuries. And that example is very clear with the Victoria map, where Victoria's harbor remains very, very contaminated. And that's because the chemicals are not being buried. It's
Right.
not, what I'm saying there is not to say that it's the best way to manage harmful chemicals. In fact, I think source control before things are released into the environment is far more effective and meaningful. And regulatory intervention in Ottawa, if you have a harmful chemical, is the preeminent way to prevent harm. So I hope that answers your question. Sedimentation is a natural process, and fundamentally, layer upon layer of sediments is going to bury these things that we've been releasing for decades, if not hundreds of years.
Okay, thank you. So basically, dredging is like something that we really should probably just avoid doing, in other words.
Dredging, yeah, it's a difficult one because dredging has to happen for safe and navigable waters. Transport Canada, Port of Vancouver are going to want that. But we've got to be careful about how we do it, because you're right. A lot of the older layers, if you will, the deeper layers of sediments have higher concentrations of these old nasty chemicals, and we're basically dredging them up. So I did work between Department of Fisheries and Oceans and ECCC as a scientist to provide advice on that file, and we came up with a simplified model to try to support best practices with dredging and with disposal. And so in BC, that protocol, which is espoused under the Disposal at Sea Act, the Disposal at Sea regulations, is more precautionary than it used to be. So, and I won't bore you with details, but yes, you always want to be mindful that sediments harbor a history of contamination. Yeah. Maybe I'll just go down. No data points in False Creek. Yes, thank you, John. We just had a meeting today with Metro Vancouver and City Vancouver. Stand by. I think we're going to have an exciting couple of years in False Creek to generate some new data on all of these contaminants of concern. So I think we're looking, anybody in this room today interested in False Creek, please ping me and I'll get you in touch with the False Creek Friends. David Grake and Zeta are two champions there, and we will be doing a nice partnership with the City of Vancouver and Metro Vancouver. That'll be a new watershed that will be added to our Healthy Waters program.
Excellent. Thank you.
Do you live near there, John?
No, I don't, but actually a number of people with Nature Vancouver have been engaged with Hakai and Friends of False Creek and a few organizations over the last several years, and we actually have a project or two that we've been trying to move forward in that area. So as part of a much bigger plan by, as you would know, a very large team of partners in there. So I just said, as I looked at the tracker, I went, oh no, False Creek is not there, and so that's great. We know Zeta, we meet every once in a while, so I'll get in touch with him, and that's great news. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, Pollution Tracker. I'm no longer at the Vancouver Aquarium and Oceanwise, but it continues. And Metro Vancouver does a lot of sediment work, and David Gregg is very, very interested in the sediment story. So we'll be doing Healthy Waters, which is primarily water oriented, but we'll be doing road runoff, tap water, source water. We're going to do Hinge Park Creek, and then we'll be doing the False Creek Waters, and then we'll be looking for funding to do some sediment work. But I have little doubt that we'll be able to do that, because it is a very important part of understanding the quality of that body of water. So yeah, hopefully you'll,
Mm.
yeah, raise your hand and contact Zeta and David and or me, and we'll
Oh,
keep this conversation going. It's timely.
okay.
Thanks, John. Let's see. Oh yeah, John, you asked a second question there. Citizen
Yeah.
scientist team. Yeah, well, Nature Vancouver, I'd say the False Creek one is a good example of an opportunity there. A lot of what we do is not terribly field intensive. When we go to collect water, we do it twice a year, and it's 1 day each. And it's not a lot of sites. It's we collect about 15 liters per category of 5 water samples. But each sample costs us about $8,000. It's very expensive to do all of these analytes. So we spend most of our time contracting out to service labs. But we do want, certainly, we want some training, some engagement, some sharing, and some innovation. So I know that the False Creek Friends want to bring a lot of people along for the ride. When we share data and findings, we start thinking about solutions, whether it's dealing with dog owners that aren't picking up after their dogs that create E. coli, or whether it's runoff, or whether it's a riparian zone restoration program, or a daylighting activity that the city might be engaged in. So I think where we really want your community support is in the thinking about our findings and the findings of others, and how this might drive education or restoration or stewardship in the False Creek area.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Peter, maybe you can clarify, are you talking about the BC Coastal Marine Strategies policy? Peter Bellin maybe has left.
No, I'm here. Sorry, I had to unmute myself on a big screen.
Okay.
Yes, I am.
Okay, so I'm not a lot of the policies that have been announced by the provincial government, including a watershed security file, are fairly new, and so I'm happy enough to do a lot of work in the wings together with our watershed partners and generate the data, and then we're starting to get requests for advice or requests to share information, and I'd like to come armed with data and findings and the opportunity to weigh in from my perspective to provincial and federal authorities. But we don't have, at this point, we don't really have provincial or federal funding, which is disappointing. I think the bad news aspect of what we do, and also there's often a feeling that contaminants is not my responsibility. It's that other agency's responsibility. And you go to that other agency, they say the same thing. They point back to the other one. So there's a lot of finger pointing and not as much interest in the contaminant file. I'm hoping that that's changing with a lot of the provincial and federal policies that have been developed over the last number of years. There's lots more capacity, lots more interest, lots more engagement, a lot more Indigenous buy-in and support for everything from spill response to enforcement. So I think I'll take note of your question, and I'll remind myself to reflect a little more on the opportunities to engage with the provincial government in particular, because I've always found it easier to talk to
My impression is that there's a real opening there, and that there
colleagues and
may
friends
be
than
federal
the
funding which
province.
can come into that.
I'm going to look into that. Thank you for that suggestion and comment. Joan, if you can hear me, seal for so PCDEs, polychlorinated diphenyl ethers, and polychlorinated naphthalenes. Both of those were contaminants in pulp and paper effluent, and they've been declining. That speaks to source control and some changes in practices that accompanied the discovery of very high levels of dioxins and furans in the late 1980s in pulp mill effluent. So there's some good news files that are going along for the ride. The PBDEs since the year 2010 have continued to decline, but not as quickly. Yeah, personally, it's been a little bit challenging for me to. I use the harbor seals to basically track pollutants at the top of the food chain along, but my position when I was at Fisheries and Oceans Canada as a federal scientist was axed during the Harper era in 2012, and so that kind of severed my my momentum around tracking pollutants at the top of the food chain. Then I moved over to Vancouver Aquarium, and we tried to keep it going, but we modified. So my career is kind of had to evolve as I've gone, but I will say this: I know that my colleagues that remain in the rejuvenated Fisheries and Oceans Canada are mindful that it would probably be useful to sample harbor seals again to get an indication as to what's happening with the trends at the top of the food chain. DFO and myself have measured PBDs in killer whales, and they are declining. They continue to decline, so we'll be able to update that story. But it's hard to monitor. I find that a lot of managers don't like to monitor or don't like monitoring programs because they commit them to future financial liabilities. So oftentimes the best environmental monitoring we have is from dedicated scientists that have a pet project around, let's measure, DDT in seagull eggs, or let's measure carbon dioxide in mountain air, or let's measure PCBs in harbor seals or something. A lot of times these come from scientists, and when governments intervene to axe programs or people, it can really create a lot of distress in terms of that being able to track progress or response to regulations and to create the good news. So I hope that answers Joan. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I was just wondering about I put it down there badly, but yeah, the PBDEs, the fire retardants, if they were actually starting to decrease a little bit, and that's good news that they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And PBDs were problematic because whereas PCBs, which were polychlorinated biphenyls, were largely industrial products, PBDEs, the polybrominated diphenyl ethers, were largely consumer. So if you bought a mattress in the year 1990 or 1995 or a couch, it probably was just soaked with these PBDE compounds to reduce fire risk. So it was used to prevent flammability. And industry was adamant that they were doing the right thing to protect human lives because 400 Canadians die every year in fires. What industry selling these chemicals did not tell you is that 80% of those fatalities in Canadian fires were from smoke, not from flames. And when you put flame retardants into a couch or a mattress or other furniture, you create smoke. So anyway, that's a little bit of a pet peeve about that whole thing. There's a big scandal in the United States with the chemical industry inventing victims. It was, yeah, it's a bit of a sidebar conversation, but there's a long history of inappropriate and unethical lobbying and marketing on the part of the chemical makers that were promoting these flame retardants. Roundup, yes, I think you can. I'm trying to remember. Roundup is glyphosate is the active ingredient. Glyphosate has been used extensively as an herbicide in the forestry sector in BC. Now, somebody updated me on this. For the longest time, British Columbia refused to have a provincial cosmetic use of pesticides ban, which Quebec's had for probably 30 years, and I think Ontario for less than that. Does anybody in this call know if BC has a pesticide ban in place for cosmetic? And by cosmetic, I mean just to get rid of dandelions around your house or something like that.
I know that like glyphosate's banned in Quebec, for example, but you can still buy it here, and
I think so.
there's so much information
Yeah,
about
so
it.
that's what you're saying. Yeah, I think so. And glyphosate is a controversial one. It was thought to be largely harmless and thought to, well, it's water soluble and thought to break down very quickly. But right now, I think Bayer owns the rights to Roundup, and a big German manufacturer, and they're getting sued up the yin yang by in the United States. They're getting sued for a lot of money for glyphosate related occupational cancers. I don't know how strong the evidence is of that, but the courts have certainly been favoring the victims and not Bayer on this one. So why can we still buy it? Yeah, good question. It's another one I have to follow up on, because I know that there was some kind of update to provincial legislation on the use of cosmetic use of pesticides in BC.
Thanks.
More, or is that it? Oh,
One more.
hang on. Question. So this is from Christine again.
Yeah.
Yep. So is Raincoast looking for partners to unroll widespread green infrastructure to control source discharge from roads and stormwater, not from green roof infrastructure network? Yeah. Low hanging fruit. I love it. I love it. And you know, it's fun. People like to talk about green infrastructure, and municipal engineers love to understand that it can, you know, they take the data that you can generate from road runoff and say, oh, we can fix that. So there are big infrastructure dollars out there, and there's exciting multidisciplinary restoration initiatives. So absolutely, green roof infrastructure network. I don't know about greenbc.org, but I'm going to look that up. So thank you for that, Christine. I don't know, did you want to make a plug or expand on your observation here?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Yeah, Grid BC is quite a new project. It actually is a result from BCIT shutting down its green roof programming. So I'm a co-founder of Grid BC to give a voice to ecological green infrastructure, since BCIT is not speaking on that platform anymore. So we're very new and really just trying to build a network of figuring that the more involved, the merrier. And especially because green infrastructure is like ecologists, engineers, communities, people who love nature, clean air, fish, trees, like cool cities. Yeah, I just wanted to put that on everyone's radar, that this is a very new, maybe the newest nonprofit in the room. And yeah, really keen to build that network.
Super, that's fabulous. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, I think, are there any more questions? Otherwise, I'm going to thank the question participants for your great questions, and thank Peter so much for giving us so much information and so much food for thought. And I know I, for one, am interested in doing what I can just as a regular citizen, but also part of Nature Vancouver and our projects like, you know, the oyster survey in False Creek and the upcoming fish forage project. And I'm sure that the role of chemical pollution is going to come and surface in all these things that we do. We have to be aware. So just lots of information, Peter, and it's going to take me a while to process everything, but it was really, really informative. And thank you so much for staying in the field when it's not so easy to be a scientist these days.